Angus Blackwood had been 36 years upon this earth, and many of them had carved deeper lines in him than his age allowed. A widower's weight rested on his shoulders, with no children to carry his name and no partner to share the hearth. The cabin was his only companion, its logs darkened with years of storms and seasons. At night, he sat by the fire alone, the chair across from him as empty as the other half of his bed. Those who knew him in town spoke of his size before they spoke of his nature. Giant Blackwood, they called him, strong as an ox, with hands like hammers. But the truth of him lived not in his strength, but in his silence. He did not go to the saloon, nor did he court the laughter of neighbors. He kept his words few and his world smaller still. That evening the air pressed close, heavy with the smell of pine and imminent snow, when a sound broke against the cabin door. It was not the wind, nor the loose rattle of branches. It was a deliberate knock, sharp, hurried, and trembling. Angus paused with a log in his arms, his head lifting, every instinct sharpening in the stillness. No one came to his door after dark, not in winter, not without reason. He set the log down slowly, moved to the door, and pulled it open with a cautious hand. There they stood, small as birds and just as fragile. Two identical Chinese girls, no more than 7, their faces mirror images of terror. Their black hair was tangled and damp from snow, and their cheeks were blotched red with a cold that seemed to have settled deep into their bones. They wore only thin, tattered brown tunics in a style foreign to these lands, torn at the hems. Their feet were bare, blue from the frost, their toes raw against the frozen porch boards. Their dark eyes were wide, not from the cold, but from a fear that had settled deeper than any frost. They looked up at him, a giant shadow in the doorway, and whispered in unison, their words hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "They want to hurt Mama. She is sick." Angus felt the words strike against the silence of his cabin, echoing in places he thought long closed. For a moment, he did not move. The girls' lips trembled, but they did not cry. They had already run out of tears. They stood with a desperate dignity that no child should know, holding themselves as though they could keep the world from shattering if they only stood still enough. "Who is your mama, children?" Angus asked at last, his voice low, like the rumble of earth before a storm. One of the girls swallowed hard, her throat small and thin beneath the dirt smudged across her skin. "My Lynn. They left her at the old shack by Miller's Creek. She can't get up. Please, sir, please help her." The name pulled at him like a half-forgotten tune. He had seen her in town, a quiet woman of soft features, dulled by weariness, her eyes always downcast when her husband was near. Corbin Thorne was his name, broad-shouldered but quick with drink and quicker with his fists. Angus had watched once as Corbin barked at her in the general store, and she had wilted like grass beneath a boot. He had turned away, as most men did, not out of cruelty, but out of the old Western code. Another man's home was not yours to trespass upon, even when it was cruel. Yet hearing her name now from the lips of her children pierced him deeper than the winter wind. He crouched low, the boards of the porch creaking under his weight, so that his great height would not frighten them. "What are your names, little ones?" he asked. "Leanne," said one. "And Sue," whispered the other. Angus saw the bruises on their small arms and the way they clutched the torn sleeves of their tunics. Something hardened in him, a quiet fury that ran deep like fire hidden in the roots of a tree. "Get inside," he told them, standing tall again. They hesitated, but when the wind gusted and nearly knocked them sideways, they stepped past him into the warmth. Angus pulled his coat tighter and strode into the night. Miller's Creek lay a mile off through bare cottonwoods that rattled like bones. The shack came into view, a sagging ruin of logs and broken shingles. He pushed the door open, the wood groaning on its rusted hinges. Inside, the air reeked of damp straw and stale whiskey. In the corner, upon a pallet of rags, lay my Lynn. Even in the shadows, her injuries told their story. Her cheek was swollen and purpled, one eye nearly closed. Yet her gaze, when it lifted to him, was not pleading. It was proud and steady. "You shouldn't have come," she rasped. "They'll say things. They'll ruin you." "Let them say," he murmured. He slid his arms beneath her with a tenderness that belied his size, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. He carried her through the snow, his coat wrapped around her slight frame, her head resting against his chest. At the cabin, Leanne and Sue ran to the door. When they saw their mother in Angus's arms, their faces lit with a relief that made them seem years older and younger all at once. He laid Mylin gently upon his own bed. The twins climbed onto the bed beside her, tucking themselves close. Angus moved to the hearth, stoking the fire until the flames crackled strong. He fetched water and tore cloth, and with rough but careful hands, began to clean Mylin's wounds. He worked in the kind of silence that spoke more than words ever could. "You are safe here. No hand will strike you again." Outside, snow fell heavier, blanketing the prairie in white. Yet within that cabin, a fragile warmth took root. But peace was a fragile thing. Already in the tavern across town, Corbin Thorne's voice carried loud and bitter. He told anyone who would listen that his wife had been stolen, that the giant had taken her. He spat Angus's name with venom, vowing to reclaim what was his. Men muttered and nodded, eager for a story to tell through the long winter nights. Back at the cabin, Angus stood by the fire, looking down upon the sleeping mother and her children. Something stirred in him he had not felt in years, not desire, but the raw pulse of responsibility. He stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain. The prairie stretched dark and endless. Somewhere out there, he knew Corbin was sharpening his anger. Angus's jaw tightened. He had made his choice the moment he lifted Mylin from the dirt floor. Whatever came now, he would not let her fall again. As the wind howled, the cabin became more than a shelter, it became a battleground of whispers, a place where one man's silence would stand against another's fury. Within that circle of warmth, 3 lives now moved carefully around one another. Angus rose before dawn as always, but his rhythm had shifted. He was no longer tending only to cattle and fence lines, but also to 2 fragile souls. Mylin lay in his bed, her bruises mottling into deep hues of yellow and green. She woke to the smell of simple broth that Angus prepared with clumsy hands. She would murmur her thanks, and he would nod once, returning to his place by the hearth as though he feared his presence might overwhelm her. Leanne and Sue, ever watchful, clung close to their mother. But slowly, as the days stretched on, their eyes began to wander toward Angus. They watched the way his giant hands split wood and the way his shoulders seemed broad enough to shield the cabin from the storm itself. In their hearts, a quiet trust was forming. One evening, Angus offered them 2 small figures he had whittled from scrap wood, a pair of identical horses. The girls held them tight as though they were gold, whispering to them before sleep. Mylin noticed these small things. Shame pressed heavy upon her, heavier than the bruises Corbin had left. To be in another man's home, cared for by him, meant whispers would be born in town. She knew the way of gossip, especially for a woman of her heritage in a town that saw her as an outsider. Now those same mouths would shape sharper words, fallen woman, shameless, unfit. Angus felt the weight, too. Each time he rode into town for supplies, eyes followed him. Men in the saloon spoke low, and women paused their sewing on porches, their glances sliding like knives across his back. He said nothing, letting his silence armor him. Yet when he returned to the cabin, the air seemed softer, filled with the girl's quiet chatter or Mylin's soft hum as she stirred broth. Those sounds carved through his solitude in ways no gossip could undo. One morning, the church bell tolled across the frozen plain. Angus decided the children deserved the warmth of prayer, and Mylin deserved to feel the world again, even if it judged her. "They will stare," she whispered, clutching her daughter's hands. Angus met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "Let them." Inside the small, worn church, conversations faltered as Angus led Mylin and the twins to a pew near the back. Reverend Gable lifted his sermon, but his eyes lingered a beat too long upon Mylin, as though weighing her presence. After the service, Mrs. Agatha Finch, ever the sharp tongue, cornered Mylin at the steps. "My dear," she said with a smile too sweet to be kind. "It must be hard to endure such trials. But perhaps it would be more fitting if you found a place among your own kind. Folks are talking." Before My Lin could falter, Angus's shadow fell across them. His gaze was heavy upon Mrs. Finch, and without a word, he stepped closer. His silence was sharper than any rebuke. Her smile faltered, and she scurried off, muttering something about prayer. That night, My Lin sat by the fire, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've brought ruin upon you," she whispered. Angus looked up from the wood he was carving. His voice came slow and steady. "It isn't forgiveness I'm after. It's peace." Her breath caught, for no man had ever spoken to her that way, not as something broken or owned, but as someone worthy of peace. The outside world grew sharper. In the saloon, Corbin Thorne's voice rang louder, his pride stung deeper than his fists had ever struck. He spat that Blackwood had stolen his wife, that she belonged to him. He drank deeper, promising he would ride out, gather men if need be, and drag her back. News of these words reached My Lin, and she returned to the cabin pale and shaken. "He'll come for me," she told Angus, her hands trembling. "He'll never stop." Angus set aside his work, his jaw hard. Let him come. His words carried no boast, only a certainty that made her heart quiver. One night, Leanne and Sue crept from their pallet to where he sat by the fire. "You won't let him hurt Mama again, will you?" they whispered in unison. Angus lifted them into his lap, his great hands holding them gently. "Not while I draw breath," he said. The children pressed their heads against his chest, listening to the deep, steady beat of his heart, and fell asleep there, safe at last. My Lin watched from the bed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had once believed all men carried violence in their hands. But here was one who carried children as though they were glass and bore shame in silence rather than let it fall on those weaker than him. Something fragile and dangerous stirred within her, a hope she had buried years ago. But hope was a fire that drew shadows. One evening, Angus returned from town to find a note nailed to his door. The words were scrawled and angry, "She's mine. Bring her out, or I'll bring men to take her." He tore the note down, crumpling it in his fist. He looked into the cabin where My Lin stirred soup and her daughters played with their wooden horses. The world had chosen sides, and by opening his door, he had declared his. A reckoning was drawing near, carried on the hooves of a man who would not rest until his pride was fed. The storm announced itself first with a low moan across the prairie. Hollis Miller felt it before the sky broke, an ache in his bones that made the cattle restless. The air turned sharp, laced with the scent of iron and snow. He worked quickly to secure the barn doors, the rope taut beneath his hands. Behind him, the cabin stood against the grey like a solitary sentinel, its windows glowing with firelight. Inside, My Lin moved with quiet urgency, shuttering windows and tucking food into covered bins as if preparing for a siege. Leanne and Sue followed at her skirts, clutching the carved wooden horses that had become their talismans. By dusk, the first lash of wind struck, rattling the cabin timbers. Angus entered, shutting the door hard against the gale. He met My Lin's eyes with a slow nod. The storm outside was not the only one they had to face. Word had reached him in town that Corbin Thorne, fueled by drink, had sworn before a circle of men that he would reclaim his wife, boasting he would not come alone. Now, as the storm thickened, My Lin sensed the weight upon him. "Do you think he will come in this weather?" she asked softly. "If a man's rage is hot enough," Angus said, "even the storm won't cool it." For so long she had endured Corbin's wrath, bending beneath it. Now, the thought of him returning made her stomach knot. Yet there was also an ember of defiance, sparked by the sight of her children sleeping warm by a fire. The hours stretched long. Angus moved from door to window, checking latches, his every movement steady. The girls drowsed against their mother's lap, their soft breaths a counterpoint to the storm's roar. My Lin watched the giant man, the way he seemed carved from the same timber as the cabin itself, unyielding and enduring. Near midnight, over the howl of wind, came another sound. Hoofbeats, crunching through snow, drawing closer. "They're here," My Lin whispered, fear cracking her voice. Angus moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutter. Against the swirl of snow, he counted 3, perhaps 4, mounted figures. One voice cut above the wind, loud and angry, the voice of Corbin Thorne. "Get them into the back room," Angus said quietly. "Do not open that door unless you hear my voice." She gathered the twins quickly and pulled them into the small back room where blankets were piled high. The door closed softly behind them. Angus remained in the main room, a rifle propped against the wall. A pounding of fists came against the cabin door. "Blackwood!" Corbin roared. "You think you can steal what's mine? Bring her out, or we'll drag her ourselves." Angus said nothing. He lit a lantern, casting his great shadow across the room, and then unbarred the door. Snow burst inward, but he stood firm. The men flinched at the sudden light, their faces raw from cold, their eyes red-rimmed with drink and rage. "You've shamed me, Blackwood," Corbin spat. "I'll see you ruined before this night ends." Angus stepped forward onto the porch, the storm clawing at his coat. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying even through the gale. "She was never yours to break." The word struck harder than any fist. Rage boiled over, and Corbin spurred his horse forward, shouting to the others, "Drag her out." Angus set the lantern down, freeing his hands. The first of Corbin's men dismounted, stumbling toward the porch. Angus met him, his great frame a wall against the storm. The clash of bodies rang sharp against the night. Fist swung, boots slid. Angus moved with the power of a man who had labored all his life, each blow precise, each step unshaken. Another man came, and then another, but still he did not falter. The fight raged, the lantern light flickering wildly, until at last the men staggered back, bruised and blooded, their rage cooled by the unyielding force of one man's defense. But Corbin remained, his pride greater than his fear. He dismounted, stumbling forward, his fists clenched. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you can shame me? I'll burn this place to the ground before I let her stay." Angus stood in the snow, his chest heaving. His silence now held the weight of a vow. The snow fell heavier, cloaking the land in white, turning the world into a frozen stage for the reckoning yet to come. Snow swirled across the prairie as Elias Carter advanced, his fists tight. Angus met him in silence, the breadth of his shoulders squared. The cabin door behind him was shut tight, protecting Mai Lin, Lian, and Sue within. He felt their nearness like a flame at his back. "You think you've won?" Corbin sneered. "She's mine. She always will be." Angus's reply came low, with the gravity of a man who had carried silence for a lifetime. "She belongs to no man. She belongs to herself." The word struck harder than snow. Corbin surged with renewed fury, his fist swinging wild. Angus caught the blow, the force jolting through him but not breaking him. He countered, a heavy strike that sent Corbin stumbling back. Yet still, he rose, mad with wounded pride, lunging again. Their struggle became a dance in the storm, Corbin flailing with the recklessness of a man who feared being small, Angus moving with the precision of one who bore a responsibility greater than his own life. At last, Angus caught him by the collar, his massive hand closing around the cloth, and slammed him against the porch post. The wood shuddered. "Do it," Corbin hissed, blood streaking his lip. "Break me. Kill me. That's what they'll expect from the giant." Angus's fist hovered, the temptation of vengeance burning hot. But then, faint through the howl, he heard another sound. The muffled voices of the twins calling for their mother. That small sound pierced deeper than any taunt. He lowered his fist. Justice was not blood upon the snow, it was dignity returned. He flung Corbin down into a drift and pressed the barrel of his rifle, never fired, against his chest. "You'll answer for what you've done," Angus said, his voice a vow in the night. "Not here, not by my hand. By the law." He dragged Corbin up, half carrying him toward his horse. The other men, cowed by the giant's resolve, mounted without a word. Angus thrust Corbin into the saddle. "Tell the sheriff I'll be by at dawn," he said. "And if you return here again, you'll find no storm strong enough to hide you." The men spurred their horses, dragging Corbin with them into the whirling dark. Angus stood a long moment in the snow before stepping back inside. Warmth met him. My Lynn stood near the hearth, her face pale but her eyes fierce. The twins clung to her skirts. "You could have killed him," she said, her voice trembling. "A man like that wants to make you as small as he is," Angus replied, his gaze steady. "He won't break me. And he won't break you again." Her eyes glistened. For the first time, she let herself believe those words. The twins broke the silence, running forward to press themselves against Angus's legs. "You saved us," they whispered. He bent, lifting them gently into his arms, and they curled into his chest as though it were the safest place on earth. They sat by the fire as the storm softened into a white, silent blanket over the world. The children drifted to sleep in Angus's arms. He did not move them, only looked down, the lines of his face softened by the glow. My Lynn's heart tightened. To hope again was the bravest and most dangerous act of all. Hours passed. Angus at last laid the sleeping girls on their pallet. He stood facing My Lynn across the firelight. No words were spoken, yet in the silence, something shifted. His silence, once heavy, now seemed a kind of vow. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I am not his anymore." Angus's jaw tightened, but he gave no answer. He did not need to. The fire crackled as dawn began to brush faint silver against the snow. The storm had passed, but in its wake, something new remained. 3 lives, once broken, had begun to root themselves together. Yet shadows lingered. Corbin's threats were not gone, only delayed. Justice would demand its price, and tongues would wag sharper than ever. As dawn pressed against the shutters, Angus finally spoke again, his voice as low as the earth itself. "This is only the beginning." My Lynn's breath caught at the truth in his words. Her eyes met his across the fading firelight, and something unspoken passed between them, fragile as glass, strong as stone. The storm outside had ended, but the reckoning had only just begun.